All right, let's get right into it. Welcome to this explainer, where we're stepping out onto the pitch to analyze something absolutely fascinating. We are looking at how nearly a century of engineering and design separates the vintage, original 1930 World Cup footballs from the highly advanced upcoming 2026 technology. We are going to break down exactly what happens when you take these two completely different eras of sports engineering and put them on the exact same field.
To truly understand the evolution of sports gear, we can't just stare at blueprints or read old history books. We have to actually put these historical artifacts through a trial by fire against modern perfection. So we're asking the ultimate question here. Can 1930s leather realistically compete with the cutting-edge tech of 2026? What actually happens to the physics of the game when players are forced to use gear that's nearly 100 years old?
In a direct head-to-head, we're looking at the original 1930 World Cup balls, which were officially named the Tiento and the T-Model. These things are characterized by incredibly heavy, thick, stitched leather and a really rigid structure. Standing in stark contrast is the 2026 Trionda, which players instantly identified as feeling, well, perfect. The Trionda features this sleek, thermally bonded synthetic surface designed for a flawless aerodynamic bounce. The difference in the raw material alone is just staggering.
And right out of the gate, the players testing these balls noted that massive physical contrast. One player, humorously, but honestly pretty accurately, compared the lopsided, rigid 1930 ball to a potato. I mean, when you place a heavy, laced leather sphere that can't even hold a perfectly round shape next to the immaculate bounce of the 2026 Trionda, the physical realities of the past become immediately obvious.
So, how does a leather potato actually play? Let's move on to test one. Touch and penalty performance, where pure physical design directly meets technique.
Actually, quick fun historical side note for you before we get to the kicks. Back in that very first World Cup final, hosted by Uruguay in 1930, they famously used exactly two different balls. Why? Well, the teams literally couldn't agree on which one to use. So they compromised by using one ball for the first half and a completely different one for the second.
Okay, back on the pitch for our penalty test. The players decided to really push the limits of the 1930 design by attempting delicate, highly technical shots like a panenka. Now, if you follow football, you know a panenka requires the ball to float with a very specific aerodynamic trajectory. But the 1930 ball, without modern paneling and with all that uneven weight, it was incredibly unpredictable off the boot. It was basically a total wild card.
And that unpredictability became even more obvious during the crossbar challenge. Players were just completely frustrated. One of them flat out said you can't even spin that ball. The heavy leather literally resists the physics of modern curve and spin. Precision targeting relies so heavily on a player's ability to manipulate the ball's aerodynamics, but with this vintage gear, it became nearly impossible. The ball simply does not want to bend.
Right, let's see what happens when the ball leaves the grass in test 2, aerial dynamics and headers.
This brings us to a very real and rather painful concept that came up during testing, the 1930 face. Unlike the highly cushioned synthetics of the 2026 Trionda, heading the dense, rigid T-model requires significant caution. Its mass is totally unforgiving. Imagine a heavy leather medicine ball flying directly at your head.
During the header challenge, players were directly warning each other about this. They joked, but were totally serious, that taking this vintage gear to the dome would leave you with a battered 1930 face. And think about how that fear completely alters the game. If every single header comes with a dose of physical pain, the entire tactical approach to lofted passes and corner kicks has to shift completely. For our final case study, Test 3 focuses on pitch physics and foot golf to really illustrate how vastly different eras handle friction and momentum.
The rules for this foot golf test were pretty grueling. Players had to navigate a multi-stage course, score in a small goal, strike another ball, hit the crossbar from a distance, and then score in a final goal. Navigating that step-by-step required immense touch control and spatial awareness.
And here is where the players quickly discovered a glaring flaw in the 1930 design when it comes to precision ground play. As one player exasperatedly pointed out, this ball doesn't stop, it just keeps on rolling. Because the smooth, heavy leather of the vintage ball lacks the modern microtextures and synthetic grips we take for granted today, it just can't generate stopping friction against the turf.
So it all comes down to kinetic energy management. A modern 2026 ball grips the turf and decelerates predictably, which is what allows for those perfectly weighted passes. But the vintage 1930 gear, it acts like a runaway freight train.
Once you set that heavy mass in motion, its momentum just carries it endlessly forward. It makes gauging power on a pass or a delicate footgolf shot incredibly difficult. So looking back at the evolution of footballs, from the penalty spot to those painful headers to the runaway footgolf balls, what is the ultimate takeaway here? When you break down the actual data, the 2026 Trionda offers total mastery over bounce, spin, and friction. It fundamentally changes the physics of the game. A modern player can bend a shot, cushion a header, and weight a pass with absolute certainty. Compare that to the 1930 ball, where rigid bounces, zero spin capability, and raw, heavy momentum meant players were often fighting their own equipment just as much as they were fighting the opposing team. This explainer really highlights how profoundly the beautiful game has physically transformed through engineering alone. I mean, if less than a century of innovation turned a heavy, lopsided leather potato into a perfectly predictable aerodynamic sphere, what kind of invisible, groundbreaking tech will define the World Cup ball another century from now in 2126? It's wild to think about. Thanks so much for joining me to explore the fascinating evolution of the game. Keep questioning the world around you and keep learning.